A question of identity. The American student colony in Paris is a social phenomenon so amorphous as to at once demand and defy the generality. One is far from being in the position of finding not enough to say. One finds far too much, and everything one finds is contradictory. What one wants to know at bottom is what they came to find. To which question there are, at least, as many answers as there are faces at the cafe tables. The assumed common denominator, which is their military experience, does not shed on this question as much light as one might hope. For one thing, it becomes impossible, the moment one thinks about it, to predicate the existence of a common experience. The moment one thinks about it, it becomes apparent that there is no such thing. That experience is a private and a very largely speechless affair is the principal truth, perhaps, to which the colony under discussion bears witness, though the aggressively unreadable face which they collectively present also suggests the more disturbing possibility that experience may perfectly well be meaningless. This loaded speculation aside, it is certainly true that whatever this experience has done to them, or for them, whatever the effect has been, is, or will be, is a question to which no one has yet given any strikingly coherent answer. Military experience does not, furthermore, necessarily mean experience of battle, so that the student colony's common denominator reduces itself to nothing more than the fact that all of its members have spent some time in uniform. This is the common denominator of their entire generation, of which the majority is not to be found in Paris, or for that matter in Europe. One is at the outset, therefore, forbidden to assume that the fact of having surrendered to the necessary anonymity of uniform, or of having undergone the shock of battle, was enough to occasion this flight home. The best that one can do, by way of uniting these so disparate identities, is simply to accept, without comment, the fact of their military experience, without questioning its extent, and, further, to suggest that they form, by virtue of their presence here, a somewhat unexpected minority. Unlike the majority of their fellows, who were simply glad to get back home, they have elected to tarry in the old world, among scenes and people unimaginably removed from anything they have known. They are willing, apparently, at least for a season, to endure the wretched Parisian plumbing, the public baths, the Paris age and dirt, to pursue some end, mysterious and largely inarticulate, arbitrarily summed up in the verb to study. Arbitrarily because, however hard the ex-GI is studying, it is very difficult to believe that it was only for this reason that he travelled so far. He is not, usually, studying anything which he couldn't study at home in far greater comfort. We are limiting ourselves, for the moment, to those people who are, more or less seriously, studying, as opposed to those, to be considered later, who are merely gold-bricking. The people, for example, who are studying painting, which seems, until one looks around, the best possible subject to be studying here, are not studying, after all, with Picasso or Matisse. They are studying with teachers of the same caliber as those they would have found in the States. They are treated by these teachers with the same high-handedness, and they accept their dicta with the very same measure of American salt. Nor can it be said that they produce canvases of any greater interest than those to be found along Washington Square, or in the cold water flats of New York's Lower East Side. There is, au contraire, more than a little truth to the contention that the East Side has a certain edge over Montparnasse, and this in spite of the justly renowned Paris light. If we tentatively use, purely by virtue of his numbers, the student painter as the nearest possible approach to a typical student, we find that his motives for coming to Paris are anything but clear. One is forced to suppose that it was nothing more than the legend of Paris, not infrequently at its most vulgar and superficial level. It was certainly no love for French tradition, whatever, indeed, in his mind that tradition may be, and in any case, since he is himself without a tradition, he is ill-equipped to deal with the traditions of any other people. It was no love for their language, which he doesn't, beyond the most inescapable necessities, speak. Nor was it any love for their history. his grasp of French history being yet more feeble than his understanding of his own. It was no love for the monuments, cathedrals, palaces, shrines, for which, again, nothing in his experience prepares him, and to which, when he is not totally indifferent, he brings only the hurried bewilderment of the tourist. It was not even any particular admiration or sympathy for the French, or at least none strong enough to bear the strain of actual contact. He may, at home, have admired their movies, in which case, confronting the reality, he tends to feel a little taken in. Those images created by Marcel Carnet, for example, prove themselves treacherous precisely because they are so exact. The sordid French hotel room, so admirably detailed by the camera, speaking, in its quaintness and distance, so beautifully of romance, undergoes a sea change, becomes a room positively hostile to romance, once it is oneself, and not Jean Gabin who lives there. This is the difference, simply, between what one desires and what the reality insists on. Which difference we will not pursue except to observe that, since the reasons which brought the student here are so romantic and incoherent, he has come, in effect, to a city which exists only in his mind. He cushions himself, so it would seem, against the shock of reality, by refusing for a very long time to recognize Paris at all, but clinging instead to its image. This is the reason, perhaps, that Paris for so long fails to make any mark on him, and may also be why, when the tension between the real and the imagined can no longer be supported, so many people undergo a species of breakdown, or take the first boat home. For Paris is, according to its legend, the city where everyone loses his head and his morals, lives through at least one histoire d'amour, ceases, quite, to arrive anywhere on time, and thumbs his nose at the Puritans. The city, in brief, where all become drunken on the fine old air of freedom. This legend, in the fashion of legends, has this much to support it, that it is not at all difficult to see how it got started. It is limited, as legends are limited, by being, literally, unlivable, and by referring to the past. It is perhaps not amazing, therefore, that this legend appears to have virtually nothing to do with the life of Paris itself, with the lives, that is, of the natives, to whom the city, no less than the legend, belong. The charm of this legend proves itself capable of withstanding the most improbable excesses of the French bureaucracy, the weirdest vagaries of the concierge, the fantastic rents paid for uncomfortable apartments, the discomfort itself, and even the great confusion and despair which is reflected in French politics and in French faces. More, the legend operates to place all of the inconveniences endured by the foreigner, to say nothing of the downright misery which is the lot of many of the natives, in the gentle glow of the picturesque and the absurd, so that, finally, it is perfectly possible to be enamored of Paris while remaining totally indifferent, or even hostile to the French. And this is made possible by the one person in Paris whom the legend seems least to affect, who is not living it at all, that is, the Parisian himself. He, with his impenetrable politesse, and with techniques unspeakably more direct, keeps the traveller at an unmistakable arm's length. Unlucky indeed, as well as rare, the traveller who thirsts to know the lives of the people. The people don't want him in their lives. Neither does the Parisian exhibit the faintest personal interest or curiosity concerning the life or habits of any stranger, so long as he keeps within the law, which, after all, most people have sufficient ingenuity to do. He may stand on his head, for all the Parisian cares. It is this arrogant indifference on the part of the Parisian, with its unpredictable effects on the traveller, which makes so splendid the Paris air, to say nothing whatever of the exhilarating effect it has on the Paris scene. The American student lives here, then, in a kind of social limbo. He is allowed, and he gratefully embraces irresponsibility. And at the same time, since he is an American, He is invested with power, whether or not he likes it. However, he may choose to confirm or deny it. Though the students of any nation in Paris are allowed irresponsibility, few seem to need it as desperately as Americans seem to need it. And none, naturally, move in the same aura of power, which sets up in the general breast a perceptible anxiety and wonder, and a perceptible resentment. This is the catch for the American in the Paris freedom, that he becomes here a kind of revenant to Europe, the future of which continent it may be is in his hands. The problems proceeding from the distinction he thus finds thrust upon him might not, for a sensibility less definitively lonely, frame so painful a dilemma. But the American wishes to be liked as a person, an implied distinction which makes perfect sense to him, and none whatever to the European. What the American means is that he does not want to be confused with the Marshall Plan, Hollywood, the Yankee dollar, television, or Senator McCarthy. What the European, in a thoroughly exasperating innocence, assumes is that the American cannot, of course, be divorced from the so diverse phenomena which make up his country, and that he is willing and able to clarify the American conundrum. If the American cannot do this, his despairing aspect seems to say, who under heaven can? This moment, which instinctive ingenuity delays as long as possible, nevertheless arrives and punctuates the Paris honeymoon. It is the moment, so to speak, when one leaves the Paris of legend and finds oneself in the real and difficult Paris of the present. At this moment, Paris ceases to be a city dedicated to la vie bohème and becomes one of the cities of Europe. At this point, too, it may be suggested, the legend of Paris has done its deadly work, which is, perhaps, so to stun the traveller with freedom that he begins to long for the prison of home. Home then becoming the place where questions are not asked. It is at this point precisely that many a student packs his bags for home. The transformation which can be effected in less than a year in the attitude and aspirations of the youth who has divorced himself from the crudities of Main Street in order to be married with European finesse is, to say the very least, astounding. His brief period of enchantment having ended, he cannot wait, it seems, to look again on his native land, the virtues of which, if not less crude, have also become abruptly simple and vital. With the air of a man who has but barely escaped tumbling headlong into the bottomless pit, he tells you that he can scarcely wait to leave this city, which has been revealed to the eye of his maturity as old, dirty, crumbling, and dead. The people who were, when he arrived at Le Havre, the heirs of the world's richest culture, the possessors of the world's largest esprit, are really decadent, penurious, self-seeking, and false, with no trace of American spontaneity, and lacking in the least gratitude for American favors. Only America is alive, only Americans are doing anything worth mentioning in the arts, or in any other field of human activity. To America only the future belongs. Whereas, but only yesterday, to confess a fondness for anything American was to be suspected of the most indefensible jingoism, to suggest today that Europe is not all black is to place oneself under the suspicion of harboring treasonable longings. The violence of his embrace of things American is embarrassing, not only because one is not quite prepared to follow his admirable example, but also because it is impossible not to suspect that his present acceptance of his country is no less romantic and unreal than his earlier rejection. It is as easy, after all, and as meaningless, to embrace uncritically the cultural sterility of Main Street as it is to decry it. Both extremes avoid the question of whether or not Main Street is really sterile. Avoid, in fact, which is the principal convenience of extremes, any questions about Main Street at all. What one vainly listens for in this cacophony of affirmation is any echo, however faint, of individual maturity. It is really quite impossible to be affirmative about anything which one refuses to question. One is doomed to remain inarticulate about anything which one hasn't, by an act of the imagination, made one's own. This so suddenly affirmative student is but changing the fashion of his innocence, nothing being more improbable than that he is now prepared, as he insists, to embrace his responsibilities. The very word, in the face of his monumental aversion to experience, seems to shrink to the dimensions of a new and rather sinister frivolity. The student, homeward bound, has only chosen, however, to flee down the widest road. Of those who remain here, the majority have taken roads more devious, and incomparably better hidden, so well hidden that they themselves are lost. One very often finds in this category that student whose adaptation to French life seems to have been most perfect, and whose studies of French art, or the drama, the language, or the history give him the greatest right to be here. This student has put aside chewing gum forever. He eschews the t-shirt and the crew cut. He can only with difficulty be prevailed upon to see an American movie, and it is so patent that he is actually studying that his appearance at the cafe tables is never taken as evidence of frivolity, but only as proof of his admirable passion to study the customs of the country. One assumes that he is living as the French live, which assumption, however, is immediately challenged by the suspicion that no American can live as the French live, even if one could find an American who wanted to. This student lives, nevertheless, with a French family with whom he speaks French and takes his meals. And he knows, as some students do not, that the Place de la Bastille no longer holds the prison. He has read, or is reading, all of Racine, Proust, Gide, Sartre, and authors more obscure, in the original, naturally. He regularly visits the museums, and he considers Arletty to be the most beautiful woman and the finest actress in the world. But the world, it seems, has become the French world. He is unwilling to recognize any other. This so severely cramps the American conversational style that one looks on this student with awe and some shame. He is so spectacularly getting out of his European experience everything it has to give. He has certainly made contact with the French people and isn't wasting his time in Paris talking to people he might perfectly well have met in America. His friends are French, in the classroom, in the bistro, on the boulevard, and of course at home. It is only that one is sometimes driven to wonder what on earth they find to talk about. This wonder is considerably increased when, in the rare conversations he condescends to have in English, one discovers that, certain picturesque details aside, he seems to know no more about life in Paris than everybody knew at home. His friends have, it appears, leapt unscathed from the 19th into the 20th century, entirely undismayed by any of the reverses suffered by their country. This makes them a remarkable band indeed, but it is in vain that one attempts to discover anything more about them, their conversation being limited, one gathers, to remarks about French wine, witticisms concerning l'amour, French history, and the glories of Paris. The remarkably limited range of their minds is matched only by their perplexing definition of friendship, a definition which does not seem to include any suggestion of communication, still less of intimacy. Since, in short, the relationship of this perfectly adapted student to the people he now so strenuously adores is based simply on his unwillingness to allow them any of the human attributes with which his countrymen so confounded him at home, and since his vaunted grasp of their history reveals itself as the merest academic platitude, involving his imagination not at all, the extent of his immersion in French life impresses one finally as the height of artificiality, and even of presumption. The most curious thing about the passion with which he has embraced the continent is that it seems to be nothing more or less than a means of safeguarding his American simplicity. He has placed himself in a kind of strongbox of custom and refuses to see anything in Paris which can't be seen through a golden haze. He is thus protected against reality, or experience, or change, and has succeeded in placing beyond the reach of corruption values he prefers not to examine. Even his multitudinous French friends help him to do this, for it is impossible, after all, to be friends with a mob. They are simply a cloud of faces, bearing witness to romance. Between these two extremes, the student who embraces home and the student who embraces the continent, both embraces, as we have tried to indicate, being singularly devoid of contact, to say nothing of love, there are far more gradations than can be suggested here. The American in Europe is everywhere confronted with the question of his identity, and this may be taken as the key to all the contradictions one encounters when attempting to discuss him. Certainly, for the student colony, one finds no other common denominator. That is all, really, that they have in common, and they are distinguished from each other by the ways in which they come to terms, or fail to come to terms, with their confusion. This prodigious question, at home so little recognized, seems, germ-like, to be vivified in the European air, and to grow disproportionately, displacing previous assurances, and producing tensions and bewilderments entirely unlooked for. It is not, moreover, a question which limits itself to those who are, so to speak, in traffic with ideas. It confronts everyone, finding everyone unprepared. It is a question with implications not easily escaped, and the attempt to escape can precipitate disaster. Our perfectly adapted student, for example, should his strongbox of custom break, may find himself hurled into that coterie of gold bricks who form such a spectacular element of the Paris scene that they are often what the Parisian has in the foreground of his mind when he wonderingly mutters, "C'est vraiment les Américains." The great majority of this group, having attempted, on more or less personal levels, to lose or disguise their antecedents, are reduced to a kind of rubble of compulsion. Having cast off all previous disciplines, they have also lost the shape which these disciplines made for them, and have not succeeded in finding any other. Their rejection of the limitations of American society has not set them free to function in any other society, and their illusions, therefore, remain intact. They have yet to be corrupted by the notion that society is never anything less than a perfect labyrinth of limitations. They are charmed by the reflection that Paris is more than 2,000 years old, but it escapes them that the Parisian has been in the making just about that long, and that one does not, therefore, become Parisian by virtue of a Paris address. This little band of Bohemians, as grimly single-minded as any evangelical sect, illustrate, by the very ferocity with which they disavow American attitudes, one of the most American of attributes, the inability to believe that time is real. It is this inability which makes them so romantic about the nature of society, and it is this inability which has led them into a total confusion about the nature of experience. Society, it would seem, is a flimsy structure, beneath contempt, designed by and for all the other people, and experience is nothing more than sensation. So many sensations, added up like arithmetic, give one the rich, full life. They thus lose what it was they so bravely set out to find, their own personalities, which, having been deprived of all nourishment, soon cease, in effect, to exist. And they arrive, finally, at a dangerous disrespect for the personalities of others. Though they persist in believing that their present shapelessness is freedom, it is observable that this present freedom is unable to endure either silence or privacy, and demands for its ultimate expression a rootless wandering among the cafes. Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the heart of the American colony, so far from having absorbed the American student, has been itself transformed, on spring, summer, and fall nights, into a replica, very nearly, of Times Square. But if this were all one found in the American student colony, one would hardly have the heart to discuss it. If the American found in Europe only confusion, it would obviously be infinitely wiser for him to remain at home. Hidden, however, in the heart of the confusion he encounters here, is that which he came so blindly seeking, the terms on which he is related to his country and to the world. This, which has so grandiose and general a ring, is in fact most personal. The American confusion seeming to be based on the very nearly unconscious assumption that it is possible to consider the person apart from all the forces which have produced him. This assumption, however, is itself based on nothing less than our history, which is the history of the total and willing alienation of entire peoples from their forebears. What is overwhelmingly clear, it seems, to everyone but ourselves, is that this history has created an entirely unprecedented people, with a unique and individual past. It is, indeed, this past which has thrust upon us our present, so troubling role. It is the past lived on the American continent, as against that other past, irrecoverable now, on the shores of Europe, which must sustain us in the present. The truth about the past is not that it is too brief or too superficial, but only that we, having turned our faces so resolutely away from it, have never demanded from it what it has to give. It is this demand which the American student in Paris is forced, at length, to make, for he has otherwise no identity, no reason for being here, nothing to sustain him here. From the vantage point of Europe, he discovers his own country, and this is a discovery which not only brings to an end the alienation of the American from himself, but which also makes clear to him, for the first time, the extent of his involvement in the life of Europe.